He swore he wasn't the father and walked away. 3 years later, on a yacht, he saw the little girl with his eyes. Ethan Blackwell had built his entire life around control. Every decision, every deal, every relationship was calculated, weighed for its advantages and costs, and discarded if it threatened to weaken his grip on his carefully crafted empire. He had risen fast in the corporate world, a young CEO with piercing blue eyes and dark hair, his name whispered at the highest levels of business as both ruthless and brilliant. He was the man who never wavered, never allowed sentiment to interfere, never gave anyone the power to shift his course. And then Lily came into his life. She wasn't like the women who usually hovered around men of his stature. She was soft-spoken yet sharp, carrying an unassuming strength that drew him in without his permission. At first, he had thought of her as a pleasant distraction, a flame he could control, but in quiet moments he found himself wanting more than he was willing to admit. When Lily told him she was pregnant, his world tilted. For her, it was a moment filled with nervous hope, her dark eyes searching his face for reassurance. She had imagined, perhaps, that beneath his cold exterior he would reveal a different side, a man ready to stand by her and the life they had created together. But for Ethan, her words sounded like shackles. He didn't see a child, he saw a future he hadn't chosen, obligations that threatened his freedom, and risks that could topple his ambitions. He had never believed in family as anything other than a vulnerability, something that weakened men and stripped them of their focus. And so he responded in the only way he knew, by severing ties. His voice had been sharp, laced with disdain, when he told her he would not support her or the child. He claimed it wasn't his responsibility, that he had too much at stake, that she was foolish to think he would throw away his empire for a family he never wanted. The words cut her deeply, but he told himself it was necessary. He told himself that walking away was an act of self-preservation, that she would recover, that he would forget. He closed the door on her, believing it was final, never once looking back to see the devastation he left behind. For Lily, that night was the end of innocence. Alone and carrying his child, she faced a world that seemed determined to test her at every turn. The father of her baby had abandoned her without hesitation, and she was left with nothing but the life growing inside her and the determination not to let his rejection define her. Ethan returned to his empire, throwing himself into his work with a cold ferocity, convincing himself he had made the right choice. He celebrated deals, expanded his reach, built higher walls around himself, and dismissed the faint whispers of doubt that sometimes crept in late at night when the city went quiet and loneliness pressed in. In the polished glass towers where he reigned, no one questioned him, and no one dared to mention the past. To the world, Ethan Blackwell was untouchable, a man immune to weakness. But buried beneath his success was a truth he refused to acknowledge, a choice that had set into motion consequences he would not escape. Lily, the woman he had left behind, was not broken by his rejection. She was wounded, yes, but inside that wound a fire had been lit. As Ethan tightened his grip on the empire he thought mattered most, he could not have imagined that the very woman he dismissed would rise on her own, stronger and more powerful than he could ever have predicted. And when their paths crossed again, he would be forced to face not only her strength but also the undeniable truth of the child he had turned his back on. Lily had never felt more alone than in the weeks that followed Ethan's departure. The words he had hurled at her that night replayed endlessly in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last, but she refused to let them destroy her. The small apartment she rented felt suffocating at times, with peeling paint on the walls and the constant hum of the city seeping through the windows, but within those four walls she clung to the life growing inside her like it was the only light she had left. She worked long hours at her modest job during the day and spent sleepless nights hunched over a second-hand laptop, searching for opportunities, scribbling ideas on scraps of paper, teaching herself things she had never thought she would need to know. Fear was a constant companion, whispering that she wasn't strong enough, that she couldn't do this on her own, but determination was louder. The pregnancy was not easy. She carried the weight of exhaustion in her body, dragging herself to work despite the stares from colleagues who whispered about her situation, but every kick she felt reminded her why she couldn't give up. There were days when she wanted to collapse, when loneliness pressed down on her so heavily she could barely breathe, yet she pushed forward. She read everything she could about business, about startups, about women who had built something out of nothing. Slowly, her scattered notes began to form a plan. She had always been smart, always resourceful, but now she had a purpose sharper than survival. She wasn't only fighting for herself anymore, she was building a future for her child. By the time her daughter was born, Lily had already begun the first steps toward her own company. The nights spent researching and planning turned into meetings with small investors, many of whom dismissed her at first, unable to see past her youth, her exhaustion, or the fact that she carried a newborn with her. But she refused to accept rejection as an answer. Every dismissal hardened her resolve, every failure taught her something she used to refine her vision. She carried her daughter, Sophia, in a sling across her chest during those meetings, and though others saw it as a weakness, Lily knew it was her strength. Every look into Sophia's wide blue eyes reminded her why she was enduring humiliation and exhaustion. Money was scarce in those early years, and there were nights when Lily had to choose between a proper meal for herself and formula for Sophia. More often than not, she went hungry. She worked on her business plan while rocking her daughter to sleep, answering emails in the dead of night with one hand while holding Sophia with the other. Friends drifted away, unable to understand the depth of her struggle, but Lily stopped caring. She no longer had room for those who doubted her. She surrounded herself only with people who believed, even if that belief was only her own stubborn conviction. The breakthrough came when one of her proposals caught the attention of an investor willing to take a chance on her. He wasn't moved by pity, but by the sharpness of her ideas and the clarity of her vision. With that first injection of funds, Lily launched her company out of a cramped office space, barely furnished, but it was hers. The months that followed were grueling, with setbacks that tested every ounce of her strength, but her persistence began to pay off. Clients came slowly, then steadily, and the numbers started to grow. She reinvested every cent back into the business, refusing to indulge in anything unnecessary, because she knew success was fragile and she couldn't afford to let it slip away. 3 years later, Lily stood in the lobby of her company's headquarters, a glass-walled building she had never imagined would bear her name. The empire Ethan had once feared a child would destroy had in fact given her the fire to build her own. She was no longer the abandoned girl crying in a tiny apartment. She was a woman who had carved her place among the wealthy through resilience, intelligence, and an unshakable will. And at her side was Sophia, now a bright, playful 3-year-old, whose blue eyes mirrored the man who had denied her, a daily reminder of both Lily's greatest wound and her greatest triumph. Sophia was 3 years old when Lily began to realize just how much her daughter had become both her anchor and her compass. From the moment the child opened her striking blue eyes each morning, the world seemed a little less harsh, and every sacrifice Lily had made felt justified. Sophia had inherited Lily's dark hair, soft and slightly unruly, but her eyes were Ethan's, and no matter how hard Lily tried to ignore the resemblance, she could not escape it. Every time Sophia laughed, every time she tilted her head in curiosity, there were echoes of the man who had abandoned them, and though it hurt, Lily chose to see it differently. She told herself that those blue eyes belonged to Sophia now, not Ethan, and that they were a symbol not of betrayal but of strength, because they reminded her of how far she had come on her own. Sophia was a lively, curious child, always asking questions about the world, always wanting to know how things worked, and Lily nurtured that curiosity with patience. She took her daughter to libraries and museums, to parks and markets, turning every outing into a lesson, because she wanted Sophia to grow up not just safe but inspired. Their bond was unbreakable, formed in the countless nights when Lily had worked with Sophia sleeping beside her, in the mornings when she carried her to daycare before rushing to the office, in the afternoons when she returned exhausted but still knelt on the floor to play, no matter how heavy her body felt. Sophia was too young to understand the sacrifices, but she could feel the love woven into every gesture, and that love became the foundation of her little world. At work, Lily was known as a rising star, a woman who had transformed adversity into triumph, but behind closed doors, she was simply a mother trying to balance ambition with tenderness. She sometimes worried that her relentless drive might one day make Sophia feel neglected, so she made a rule for herself: no matter how busy she became, she would never let her daughter feel second to her success. She brought Sophia to company gatherings, where colleagues were charmed by her precocious energy, and she included her in small victories, celebrating milestones with balloons or cupcakes so that Sophia always felt the journey was theirs together. The girl became not only her daughter but also her inspiration, the reason she pushed forward when exhaustion threatened to consume her. And yet, there were moments of darkness that Lily could not deny. On quiet nights, when Sophia had fallen asleep and the apartment was filled only with the sound of her steady breathing, Lily would catch herself staring at her daughter's face and wondering what it might have been like if Ethan had chosen differently. She imagined a world where Sophia had grown up with two parents, where Lily had not been forced to build everything alone, where the burden of loneliness had not carved itself so deeply into her heart. Those thoughts were painful, but she allowed them to come and go like shadows, never letting them linger too long, because she refused to give Ethan the power to haunt her. She told herself that their life, as imperfect as it was better than anything he could have given them, because it was built on love, not obligation. Sophia, in her innocence, sometimes asked questions that cut Lily deeply. She would ask why other children had daddies who picked them up from school or why men in the park held their daughters' hands. Lily would smile gently and answer that their little family was special, that not all families looked the same, and that what mattered most was the love they shared. She reassured Sophia again and again that she was never lacking, but inside those questions left bruises. Lily feared the day her daughter would grow old enough to understand the truth, to recognize the absence of the man whose eyes she carried. But until that day came, Lily was determined to fill every corner of Sophia's life with enough love and stability to make up for it. The world outside had begun to take notice of Lily not just as a businesswoman but as a figure of admiration. Magazines praised her story, investors sought her partnership, and her company expanded rapidly. She was no longer the girl who had been discarded, she was the woman who had defied the odds. Still, her greatest pride was not the headlines or the wealth but the small hand that clutched hers as she walked through crowded streets, the child who looked up at her with unconditional trust. Sophia was her living reminder that strength could be born out of pain, and that sometimes the very thing others dismissed as a weakness could become the greatest source of power. As Lily watched her daughter grow, she also felt the distance between her past and present widening. She rarely thought of Ethan anymore, except when she glimpsed his reflection in Sophia's eyes, and even then it was fleeting. She told herself that their paths would never cross again, that he had made his choice and she had made hers, and that was the end of it. What she didn't know was that life was preparing to test her resolve, and that the walls she had built so carefully around her heart were about to be shaken when the man who had abandoned her reappeared in a way she could never have anticipated. The restaurant was one of those places designed to impress even the most jaded of the wealthy, its chandeliers dripping with crystal light, its walls lined with art worth more than most homes, and its tables filled with the elite who prided themselves on being seen there. Ethan Blackwell walked in with the quiet confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his blue eyes cold and commanding, and his tailored suit announced power before he even opened his mouth. He had grown wealthier, more influential, and more untouchable in the years since he had last seen Lily, and he carried himself as if nothing in the world could pierce his armor. But that illusion shattered the moment his gaze swept across the room and stopped at a table near the center. Lily was there. She sat upright, her posture poised yet natural, wearing a simple yet elegant dress that made her presence impossible to ignore. Time had only made her more striking, and there was a quiet strength in her expression that Ethan had never noticed before. She was no longer the girl who had clung to him with hope in her eyes. She was a woman who owned her place in the world, and every detail about her, the calm confidence in her face, the way others glanced toward her with respect, the warmth she radiated, cut through him like a blade. What unsettled him even more was the little girl beside her. Sophia sat with her hair tied back neatly, her small hands gripping a cup as she chatted animatedly to her mother, her blue eyes glimmering with curiosity and joy. Ethan froze, his entire body locking as recognition washed over him. Those eyes were his. The shape of her smile, the tilt of her head, it was like looking into a mirror of his own childhood. He felt his throat close, his breath catch, and for a moment the powerful CEO who could silence boardrooms with a glance was nothing more than a man confronted with the truth he had spent years denying. Around him, conversations continued, glasses clinked, laughter rippled through the crowd, but Ethan heard none of it. The entire room seemed to fade until there was only Lily and Sophia, a picture of the life he had thrown away. He remembered the night he had walked out, the cold certainty in his voice when he told Lily he wouldn't support her, the slam of the door as he ended everything they might have had. He had believed he was choosing freedom, yet staring at his daughter now, he realized what he had truly chosen was emptiness. The empire he had built felt suddenly fragile, hollow compared to the small child laughing at the table. Lily's eyes lifted then, meeting his across the glittering room. The moment stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting. She did not look away, though her gaze was sharp, filled with anger and an old hurt that time had not erased. For an instant Ethan thought she might rise and leave, shield Sophia from him, but instead she remained where she was, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder, a silent declaration that she had raised this child alone and needed nothing from him. The message was clear, and it stung more than any insult ever could. Ethan's chest ached as he tried to compose himself, to school his face into the mask of indifference he had perfected over years of negotiations, but the cracks showed. He could not stop the way his eyes softened when they lingered on Sophia, could not control the tremor in his hands as he reached for his drink to steady himself. He had faced hostile takeovers, crushing failures, and ruthless competitors, but nothing had ever left him so utterly undone as the sight of his daughter. He thought about walking over, about demanding a conversation, but the weight of guilt pinned him in place. What could he possibly say to the woman he had abandoned and the child who did not know his face? He had spent years convincing himself he was right, that he had done what he needed to do, but in this moment he knew he had been nothing but a coward. The girl deserved a father, and instead she had been given his absence. Lily finally turned her attention back to Sophia, dismissing him without a word, and Ethan felt the rejection in his bones. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was absolute. For the rest of the evening, he could not focus on the conversations around him, could not laugh at the jokes of his companions, could not pretend to be the man he had been when he walked in. His world had shifted in a single glance, and as much as he wanted to look away, his eyes kept returning to the table where Lily and Sophia sat, their bond a living reminder of what he had denied. By the time the dinner ended and the guests began to filter out into the night, Ethan knew his life would never be the same. He could not forget what he had seen, could not erase the image of those blue eyes that mirrored his own. He had built an empire to protect himself from loss, from vulnerability, from love, and yet all of it felt meaningless compared to the truth he had just faced. He had a daughter, and she was growing up without him. Ethan could not sleep the night after the dinner. He lay awake in his penthouse apartment, staring at the city lights stretching across the horizon, but for the first time in years, the view gave him no sense of pride. All he could see in his mind was the little girl's face, those piercing blue eyes that had looked so much like his own. He replayed the sound of her laughter, the way she leaned against Lily with complete trust, and every time he tried to close his eyes, guilt twisted deeper into his chest. For years he had told himself that walking away had been the right decision, that fatherhood would have ruined everything he worked for, but now, confronted with the undeniable truth, those justifications felt hollow. He had not saved himself, he had abandoned them. The next morning, Ethan found himself unable to focus at work. His assistants noticed his distraction, and his business partners grew impatient when he hesitated during meetings where he was usually sharp and decisive. He could not bring himself to care. Numbers, deals, and profits seemed meaningless compared to the thought that his daughter was growing up without him. Eventually, he left the office early, something he had never done before, and drove aimlessly through the city until he ended up near the restaurant where he had seen Lily and Sophia. He did not know what he was hoping for, only that he felt drawn to the possibility of seeing them again. Days passed, and Ethan finally made the decision he had been avoiding: he would try to speak to Lily. He rehearsed words in his head, apologies he had never thought himself capable of making, but when the moment came, everything collapsed. He found her one afternoon leaving a charity gala, her daughter skipping beside her, clutching a small stuffed toy. Ethan stepped forward, his throat dry, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in a boardroom. When Lily saw him, she stopped abruptly, her body stiffening, her eyes narrowing with immediate distrust. She shifted Sophia slightly behind her, instinctively protective, and her silence cut deeper than any insult. "Lily," he began, his voice lower than he expected, trembling despite his efforts to steady it. He wanted to say he was sorry, to beg for forgiveness, to explain that he had been blind and selfish, but the words tangled on his tongue. He could see in her eyes that she wasn't interested in excuses. So he said the only thing that mattered. "She's mine, isn't she?" For a moment, Lily said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she answered in a voice cold and calm, each syllable precise. "She's mine. She has always been mine." With that, she turned as if to leave, but Sophia tugged at her hand, curious about the man staring at her so intensely. The little girl tilted her head, her wide eyes studying him, and Ethan felt his heart crack under the weight of her innocence. He forced himself to smile gently, though his vision blurred with unshed tears. "Please," he whispered, his words catching in his throat. "Just give me a chance to know her." Lily looked at him then with a fury that masked something deeper. "You had your chance," she said. "You made your choice the night you walked away. We don't need anything from you now." She pulled Sophia close, and with that, she walked past him, her daughter's tiny footsteps echoing beside hers. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, the sounds of the city rushing around him, but all he could hear was the echo of Lily's words. That night, alone in his apartment, Ethan broke in a way he never had before. He poured himself a drink but could barely swallow it, his hands shaking as he set the glass down untouched. He stared at the reflection of his face in the window, the same blue eyes that his daughter had, and hated what he saw. For the first time, the mask of control and arrogance shattered, leaving him raw, grieving for the years he had lost. He realized he could not demand forgiveness, could not force his way into their lives. The only thing he could do was prove, through time and persistence, that he was no longer the man who had abandoned them. In the days that followed, Ethan began to change in ways even he did not fully understand. He started to withdraw from the endless social events that had once defined him, declining invitations to galas and dinners, instead using his time to quietly learn about the life he had missed. He discovered which schools and parks Lily brought Sophia to, and though he kept his distance, he went there too, simply to watch from afar. He wasn't stalking, he was searching for a way to understand the rhythm of their lives, hoping that one day he might find a place within it. Every time he saw Sophia's smile, every time he heard her laugh, he felt the weight of his absence but also the flicker of a determination he hadn't known he possessed. For years he had fought to conquer markets and build empires, but now he faced a different battle, the battle to prove that he could be more than his mistakes. And though Lily's rejection had been absolute, Ethan knew he could not walk away again. He had already lost too much. Ethan began to change the very next day, not because he expected Lily to notice but because he needed to strip away the man he had become in order to have any chance of building something real with the family he had denied. He stopped surrounding himself with people who only cared about his wealth and influence, canceling dinners and declining invitations that once would have boosted his status. For the first time in years, he began to spend evenings alone without distraction, confronting the silence he had always drowned in noise. That silence was brutal, but it forced him to face truths he had buried, and it made him recognize just how much of his life had been built on fear rather than courage. He found out where Sophia attended preschool, though he never approached her directly. Instead, he began donating anonymously to the school, making sure they had new books, better equipment, even funding art and music programs that had been neglected. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about giving his daughter opportunities he had once denied her by walking away. He stood outside the school one morning, hidden among the other parents, and watched her skip inside, her small backpack bouncing with each step. He saw how she waved enthusiastically at her teachers, how she carried herself with joy, and the sight filled him with both pride and grief. He wanted to run forward and call her name, but he knew that would only bring confusion and anger from Lily. So instead he stood in silence, his heart aching, telling himself that for now, loving her from a distance was the only way he could protect her. Lily noticed the changes, though she did not acknowledge them. She heard from the school about the donations, saw new opportunities opening up for Sophia, and she suspected immediately who was behind it. When she caught Ethan one afternoon sitting in his car across the street from the park where she played with her daughter, her fury rose again. She marched toward him, her expression sharp, her voice cutting as she told him to stay away. He listened, taking every word without defending himself, and when she asked if he was trying to buy forgiveness, he shook his head. "No," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on hers. "I'm just trying to give her the best of what I can. If you never let me near her, I'll still keep doing it." Lily wanted to scream, wanted to tell him that it was too little too late, but the sincerity in his tone unsettled her. Still, she turned away, unwilling to let his efforts soften her heart. Despite her resistance, Ethan persisted. He began volunteering quietly at charity events that supported single mothers, not for publicity but because he wanted to understand, even in some small way, what Lily had gone through. He listened to their stories, he donated time as well as money, and slowly he began to change from a man who took everything for granted to one who was willing to serve. His colleagues and investors whispered about his unusual behavior, wondering if he was losing his edge, but Ethan didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing profit, he was chasing redemption. Sophia, in her innocence, began to notice him too. One day at the park, she saw him sitting on a bench, watching her with the same quiet smile he always wore. She walked closer, clutching her toy in her hand, her blue eyes curious. "Why do you always sit here?" she asked, her voice light and unafraid. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. He wanted to say the truth, that he was her father, that he had been waiting for the day she might speak to him, but he swallowed the words. Instead, he said gently, "Because you remind me of something very special I lost once, and I don't ever want to forget it." Sophia tilted her head, studying him with the seriousness only a child could muster, and then she smiled before running back to her mother. Lily had watched the entire exchange, and though she wanted to be angry, she could not deny the tenderness in his voice. At night, Ethan would replay every moment of those brief encounters, every glance and every word. He kept telling himself that patience was the only path forward, that he could not erase 5 years of absence in a matter of days. The guilt was crushing, but it also fueled him to keep going. He began journaling, something he had never done, filling pages with letters he could not yet give to Sophia, telling her about his regrets, his mistakes, and his love. He imagined one day handing them to her when she was old enough to understand, hoping that she would see he had tried, even if he had come too late. Each time Ethan saw Lily, he could sense the battle inside her. She wanted to keep the walls up, to protect her daughter and herself from being hurt again, but there were flickers of doubt, moments when her eyes softened before she quickly turned away. He knew he could not rush her, but he also knew he could not stop. The woman he had once dismissed had become the mother of his child, and the strength she carried humbled him. The little girl he had denied had become the center of his world, even if she didn't yet know who he was. By the end of that year, Ethan was no longer the man who had walked away in arrogance. He was broken in some places, rebuilt in others, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight not for business, not for power, but for family. He did not know if Lily would ever let him in, but he knew one thing with certainty: he would never walk away again. Lily had always prided herself on being able to read people, to see through facades and find the truth buried underneath. It had been a skill sharpened through years of survival, years of navigating a world that dismissed her, underestimated her, and finally forced her to stand alone. But with Ethan, she found herself unsettled, caught between the man she had once known and the man who stood before her now. For so long, her memories of him had been painted in betrayal and abandonment, the image of him walking away etched permanently into her heart. Yet over the past months, she had seen something different, something she did not know how to reconcile with her anger. She noticed it first in the subtle ways he appeared at Sophia's side without intruding, like the time she saw him standing discreetly at the back of the school auditorium during Sophia's small recital. He did not announce himself, did not approach, simply stood in the shadows and clapped with quiet pride when Sophia bowed with the other children. Later that evening, when Lily tucked her daughter into bed, she caught Sophia humming happily about how she had seen the man from the park clapping for her. Lily's stomach tightened at the words, torn between fury that Ethan had been there and a reluctant recognition of the sincerity in his actions. Weeks later, when Sophia fell ill with a fever, Lily had taken her to the doctor, exhausted and overwhelmed from several sleepless nights. When she returned home, she found a delivery at her door: soup, fresh fruit, children's books, and a note with no signature. She knew immediately who had sent it. Her first instinct was to reject the gesture, to see it as an intrusion into the careful world she had built, but as she watched Sophia smile weakly while cuddling a new stuffed animal that had been included in the package, something inside her shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the faintest crack in the armor she had worn for years. Lily's friends noticed the change too. One evening, over dinner, a close friend remarked that Ethan seemed to be around more often. "Do you trust him?" the friend asked carefully. Lily had no answer. Trust was not something that could be rebuilt with gifts or presents, it was forged slowly, through proof over time. Yet she couldn't deny that Ethan's actions no longer aligned with the selfish man she remembered. He looked different now when she saw him, less polished, less arrogant, as though life had humbled him. There was a heaviness in his eyes, but also a determination she had never seen before, and though she wanted to dismiss it, she found herself wondering if he had truly changed. For Sophia, the presence of Ethan became almost natural. She began to talk about him with a kind of innocent curiosity, asking questions that Lily struggled to answer. Why does he always smile at me? Why does he bring things to school? Is he a friend? Each question left Lily torn between shielding her daughter from the truth and preparing her for it. One evening, when Sophia asked if she could sit with him the next time they saw him at the park, Lily's heart clenched. She saw the longing in her daughter's eyes, a longing for something Lily could not provide alone, and it frightened her because she knew that no matter how hard she tried, Sophia would always wonder about the father she never knew. Ethan, for his part, never pushed. He never tried to force his way into their lives, and that restraint began to erode Lily's resistance more than any grand gesture ever could. One rainy afternoon, she saw him standing in the downpour near the edge of the park, his coat drenched as he watched Sophia laugh and splash in puddles. He didn't try to join them, didn't call out, simply stood there with a quiet smile, content just to witness the moment. Something about that image lodged itself in Lily's heart, because it wasn't the act of a man seeking control or recognition, it was the act of someone who cherished what little he was allowed to have. At night, when Lily lay awake with Sophia asleep beside her, she found her thoughts drifting toward him in ways she wished they wouldn't. She remembered the man who had walked away, and she remembered the pain of carrying her pregnancy alone, but she also remembered the way his face had softened when he looked at their daughter. The contrast between the past and the present confused her, unsettled her, and forced her to question whether her anger was protecting her or imprisoning her. She had built her life on strength, on never needing anyone, but seeing Ethan now, she wondered if forgiveness was not a weakness but a different kind of strength, one she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. Her breaking point came one evening when Sophia tripped while running across the playground and scraped her knee. Lily rushed to her side, comforting her as she cried, but before she could even stand, Ethan was there. He had appeared as if out of nowhere, kneeling beside them, his hand steady as he offered tissues and a gentle voice to calm Sophia. Lily wanted to push him away, to tell him that she could handle it, but when she looked at her daughter's tear-streaked face and saw how quickly she quieted at the sound of Ethan's voice, her words caught in her throat. For the first time, she allowed him to sit with them, to help, even if only for a moment. That night, Lily replayed the scene again and again. She thought of how Sophia had looked at him, how natural it had seemed, and how much Ethan had changed from the man who once shut the door on them. She knew she could not erase the past, but she began to realize that perhaps the future did not have to be defined by it. She had always believed her daughter would grow up without a father, but now she faced the possibility that she might not. The thought was terrifying, but also, if she allowed herself to admit it, hopeful. For the first time in years, Lily's anger wavered. It did not vanish, but it bent, just slightly, and in that bend there was room for something new. She did not know yet what it meant, or if she was ready to let Ethan in, but she could no longer deny the truth she saw every time he looked at Sophia. He loved her. And though it might take time, and though the road would not be easy, Lily began to wonder if perhaps he deserved the chance to prove it. The turning point came quietly, on a night that seemed like any other, though for Ethan and Lily it would mark the beginning of something entirely new. Sophia had been invited to perform in a small recital at her school, a cheerful event filled with parents bustling to find seats and children nervously smoothing their costumes. Lily had planned to attend alone, as she always did, but when she walked into the auditorium, she saw Ethan sitting in the very back row, his posture rigid, his expression a careful mask of restraint. He had no right to be there, not officially, but something in Lily softened as she saw the way he clutched the program in his hands like it was the most important document he had ever read. She could have asked him to leave, but instead she let him stay, telling herself it was for Sophia's sake, though deep down she knew it was also because she no longer wanted to deny him completely. When Sophia stepped onto the stage, the lights illuminating her small frame, Ethan's eyes glistened with tears he refused to shed. He leaned forward slightly, his entire body aching with pride, and when Sophia sang with her classmates, her voice bright and clear, it felt to him like a miracle. He clapped until his hands stung, and though Sophia did not know the truth yet, she saw him in the audience and waved, her little face glowing. Ethan waved back, his heart breaking and healing all at once. Lily sat beside her daughter afterward, watching how Sophia's eyes lit up at the sight of him, and in that moment, the anger she had carried for years loosened its grip on her heart. After the performance, as the children scattered into their parents' arms, Ethan hesitated near the door, unsure whether to stay or go. It was Lily who surprised him. She walked toward him, Sophia holding her hand, and for the first time in years, she did not push him away. Sophia tugged free of her mother's grip and ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his legs in a gesture so natural it stole Ethan's breath. Lily stood back, watching, her arms crossed but her eyes softer than he had ever seen them. When Ethan bent down and hugged his daughter for the very first time, he felt his entire world tilt on its axis. The years of distance, the mistakes, the guilt, they all seemed to melt in that single embrace, replaced by a love so fierce it frightened him. It was not immediate forgiveness, nor was it an easy reconciliation. Lily was clear about her boundaries, reminding Ethan that he had to prove himself not through words but through actions, and that trust would not be handed to him simply because he had appeared again. But she also admitted, in a quiet voice that trembled, that she had seen his efforts, that she could no longer deny the way Sophia's life had already been touched by his presence. She told him she was willing to try, not for him, but for their daughter, and perhaps, if he continued to show he was worthy, for herself as well. Ethan nodded, accepting her terms without hesitation, because he knew he would do anything to keep that fragile door open. From that night forward, everything began to change. Ethan was no longer a shadow hovering at the edges of Sophia's world, he became a presence, cautious at first but growing more confident as Lily allowed him space. He joined them at the park, sitting on the grass while Sophia showed him her favorite games. He read bedtime stories when Lily was too tired after long days, his deep voice carrying a gentleness that surprised even him. He attended school events openly now, clapping proudly, no longer hiding in the background. Every small moment felt monumental, each step a piece of the family he had once thought lost forever. Lily struggled at times, caught between lingering hurt and the undeniable reality of Ethan's transformation. There were nights when old memories resurfaced, when she remembered the fear of raising a child alone and the bitterness of his absence. But there were also nights when she watched Sophia fall asleep in his arms, her little fingers curled into his shirt, and she realized that her daughter had found something she had always deserved. The man who had once closed the door on them had opened himself now in ways she had never imagined, and though it scared her, it also gave her hope. Ethan's world changed too. The empire he had built no longer defined him. He still worked, still ran his company, but he no longer lived for the next deal or the next triumph. He lived for the mornings when Sophia's laughter filled the air, for the evenings when Lily sat across from him at the table and allowed herself to smile. He began to understand that wealth meant nothing if it was not shared, that success was hollow without love to anchor it. He was still haunted by the years he had lost, but instead of letting that guilt consume him, he used it to fuel his determination never to repeat the same mistakes. The moment that cemented everything came on a summer evening, aboard the very yacht where Ethan had first seen them after all those years apart. This time, it was not a party filled with strangers, but a quiet outing arranged by Ethan himself. He had invited Lily and Sophia to join him, determined to create a new memory to replace the one that had nearly broken him. The sun was setting, painting the sky with gold and crimson, and as the boat drifted gently across the water, Sophia sat between them, laughing as she pointed to the horizon. Lily turned to look at Ethan, and in her eyes, he saw something he had never thought he would see again, not forgiveness, not entirely, but the beginning of trust. For Ethan, that look was everything. He reached for Sophia's hand, then for Lily's, and though she hesitated, she let him take it. Together, the three of them stood at the edge of the deck, the wind in their hair, the world quiet around them. It was not a perfect ending, not a fairy tale without scars, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for the first time in years, Ethan knew he had finally found what he had been searching for, not power, not wealth, but the family he had almost lost forever.